Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 6th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 20th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and if I'm being realistic with you this week, I'm a little nervous about this week. Because I know where we'll be going, and I know it's a controversial issue, but I think it's also one of these issues that when we talk about it in corresponding with the gospel text that we get this week, I think it really puts it into perspective a little bit of what Jesus is talking about and can kind of put our feet to the fire a little bit more. And you'll understand a little bit more what I mean by that here in a few minutes. But I think it's one of these things, again, as we talk about, as this being in the season after Pentecost, this is a growing season. This should be a challenging season. This should be something that is causing us to scratch our heads and think about things in a new and different way. And if it's not doing that, I think there's a lot of times that then we should be reflecting inward on what are we actually doing within our own faith? How are we challenging ourselves to be able to move forward? And we saw that last week with the Good Samaritan gospel. And the question we had for last week, which was, where do you show or have you seen mercy in your community? And I know for me, as I kind of have been bringing up, the storm that I have experienced up here physically and the amount of people coming together and working through that. But I think what was also a great response this last week of just the simple aspect of giving blood and platelets and how that can be monumental for the giver and recognizing that you're giving something that can be utilized by other people and how monumental that is. And we talked about that last week. But also how, as the receiver, how humbling that can be. The aspect of that someone was giving up stuff within their own body, going through temporary hardship when you're having to recreate blood and how they tell you got to take it easy for a few days in order to be able to provide life. And that's an important aspect of this. And thus, it's caused us to kind of be thinking about our whole bodies. And we got into a lot of that last week. But I think this aspect of thinking beyond ourselves, thinking about also those who are going through hard times is worth spending time and reflecting on. And I think it moves us into where we'll be going this week. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the alternative first readings you have this week is out of Amos chapter 8, the first 12 verses of it. And again, we're in another difficult spot of Amos. Again, Amos being a warning book, a lot of it. And here we get where there's this vision that is shown to Amos of a basket of fruit. And it's this idea of things have been culminating over a period of time, and we're getting toward the end. And God's saying, I'm not going to abandon my people, but I'm also not going to overlook the things that have happened. And one of the things they get into in verse 5 is the new moon when they were selling grain, that there were people who were purposely doing shady things to try to get a little bit more weight, so thus they were able to get a little bit more money for their grain. And thus, this is something that is not looked upon well by God. The aspect of how people are being cheated. And so this recognition on how there is an account and God is recognizing this, and these people who are lamenting, who have been going through hard times, at some point will be welcomed into the family of God. But this idea of these people who have been taking things for the benefit, their own benefit, and not seeing the greater picture, it's something that is not going to be looked at fondly. And so this recognition on how we need to be looking at things as a global or a group community instead of just our own personal gain. And this leads into Psalm 52, all 9 verses of it quite well. This idea coming from verse 1, why do you boast, O mighty one, of the mischief done against the godly? All day long you plan destruction. Your tongue is like a sharp razor, you're worker of treachery, through verse 2. This idea on how we sometimes can get caught up in our own self and thinking that we are greater, thinking that we are big and mighty, and this is not the person to be fighting or doing that with. That God is the one who has this steadfast love, but it also still has this way of ruling that cuts you down and humbles you. And this recognition that we should not be becoming haughty, not becoming full of ourselves because of things we think we can get away with, recognizing that God does not see it that way. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of Genesis chapter 18, the first 10 verses, so 1 to 10a. And I kind of hate that they cut it where they did this week purposely. But it's this man comes and Abraham meets him. They're talking about how the faith of the Lord has preceded them. And Abraham does a great job at making sure that there's great hospitality. He tells Sarah to make some cakes for them, that they're able to give curds and milk and cakes to this man. And this is where it is disclosed at the beginning of verse 10a that Sarah will have a son in due season. And if you know what continues on, this is where Sarah laughs. She thinks this is just crazy because they're so old. And I think that aspect being brought in, the doubt that comes with that, I think from where I'm looking at taking this week, I think is really important. And I think it's also this aspect too of, yes, the hospitality, but also being willing and able to hear what our guest has to say to us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 15, all 5 verses of it. And this then is recognizing now, coming from this servant coming from the Lord to be able to tell this message to Abraham and Sarah, this idea here of who is willing and able to spend time in the holy tent or in the holy place. Remember that they had those traveling tents at this time for the tabernacle, and this idea of who is blameless to be put in front of God, and recognizing that there is nothing that we can do that can put us on that level. There is nothing that allows us to be able to stand. There is no money or interest or bribe. It's this recognition of us being wholeheartedly fully there, and recognizing that in doing that, it allows us to be able to stand more true in front of God, recognizing that these things that tear us apart, that separate us from God, causing us to have faulties or things that we're saying that aren't true, allow us to be able to move forward. The epistle text, or second reading this week, is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 28. This is this beginning of this understanding of how we are a whole body together, and that we need to be recognizing the body of Christ together as a body. And in doing that, we also have to then be able to recognize that our actions within that affect the whole body. And that, yes, there is the steadfast love that God has for us, and that we're trying to have the steadfast faith, but it's also this recognition that we then also, our faults separate us from that with God. So we rejoice when the flesh is doing well together as a body, but we also cry, lament when we go through hardships. And so this idea of how we are able to pass things through generations, work together, and recognizing that God is in and amongst all of this as we are all trying to get closer and closer to God. The gospel text this week is a short one out of Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. And this is where Jesus enters a village, and he goes to the house of Martha and Mary. And when he gets there, the sister, Mary, sits at the feet of Jesus and listens, while Martha is distracted by many tasks, and finally comes to the Lord and says, "Lord, why do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work? Tell her to then help me." And the Lord comforts Martha by saying, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed, indeed only one. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." This idea of how Mary was willing and able to stop and to listen and to process and contemplate, while Martha just saw there was many things to do, there was things that are happening that should take my time and effort. And in doing that, then misses the greatest gift that was right there in front of her. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction and ways to be looking at and thinking about things. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the revised common lectionary coming from Vanderbilt City Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also they have the art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors. There's great daily devotions there. As we are using this time to prepare week after week and to continue to grow, I highly recommend checking out a resource like the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library to help you along that journey. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that goes through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with different events and ways to be thinking about things from more of an ecological lens. Especially if you're enjoying listening to this podcast week after week, I know you're going to enjoy some of the different homilies and ways of thinking about the different texts week after week in the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. So if you haven't checked those resources out, those will be the first links down in my references section down in the show notes, and I'd highly recommend checking that out. Sitting at the feet of Jesus, ignoring what others are telling her to do, Mary sits there and listens and is not distracted by what her sister Martha is being distracted by. We are really good at being Marthas and really struggle at being Marys. In fact, in my own life, as I've kind of continued to bring up this storm that we went through, one of the things that my wife and I were doing is we were planning for a guest that hadn't ever come, and we had young nieces and nephews that were coming. And so there was a lot of things to prepare our house for. And when the storm hit, we were spared for the most part. Everything's fine. But it also caused my wife and I to sit and reflect on what is important. What are things that are worth the time, the work, the effort, the busyness? And what are the things where it's like, really, it's okay. We're spending time with family. Let's not exhaust ourselves before that happens. Let's recognize the things that are good enough. Let's recognize the things that are okay the way that they are. And let's take a moment and breathe. And it was hard. It was hard doing that because in a lot of ways when we were watching our community and a lot of things were going on and suddenly everything is changing around us, it forces you to reconsider what is important. What are the things in life that matter? Unfortunately, I would also argue that there are some things within our worldwide culture that we're not doing a good job of. And I think there's been times where we have had messengers telling us things, and we haven't spent the time being Marys and sitting at the feet of these people, listening, processing, thinking, contemplating, instead have been distracted by world wars, by conflicts within countries, by other things, life. And now we've gotten to a point where we are in a critical time and we no longer can ignore, and now actually might have to make some extremely difficult decisions because of our lack of being Mary and instead being Martha and getting called out about it. And that is about our climate. Now, I think a lot of us who are listening to this may see this as something that really has been popping up, say, over the last 50 years, but especially the last 25 or so. But when you really dig into the history of climate change, it's much, much longer timeline than that. In the 1800s, one of the things that started to be questioned was when you started looking at this amount of solar radiation that we were getting, the amount of heat that we had on our planet versus the amount of radiation that there was coming from the sun, the numbers didn't work. And this was the beginning of us starting to understand that we have an atmosphere to be able to help trap some of that heat in, making life possible on this planet. Eugene Newton Foote was one of the first people, and a female at that, to start figuring out what is some of these different aspects of this. And she was able to recognize that when the sun is hitting different gases, that carbon dioxide was the one that warmed up the most. John Haidt agreed with her and was able to then expand upon this to start having the initial foundations of what the greenhouse effect was and how it's needed here on the planet for us to survive. The idea that there are different gases that are helping to hold heat in or reflect heat and solar radiation down, thus keeping the planet warm enough for us to survive. In 1896, a Nobel Prize winning scientist, Spons Arrhenius, stated that CO2 within the atmosphere was starting to warm the planet. And again, this is coming out of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and is stated that this is starting to be something that we need to think about. This could potentially cause warming of the planet, but no one cared. To the point that Sir George Clark Simpson, the director of the British Meteorological Office, stated, and I quote, It is now generally accepted that variations in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, even if they do occur, can have no appreciable effect on climate in 1929. This was the general consensus at the time, and thus enters in Guy Callendar. Now, he is the son of Hugh Callendar, who was a major scientist with helping us understand thermodynamics, and he started collecting weather data at the turn of the century and stated, as man is now changing the composition of the atmosphere at a rate which must be very exceptional on a geological timescale, it is natural to seek for the probable effects of such a change. And I end quote. He was starting to study what was going on within the climate. And this man deserves a whole episode at some point. But he noticed that the global temperatures had increased over the last half century, so he started collecting data from a lot of different weather stations from around the world, and concluded that our carbon emissions, or the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, had gone up from 274 parts per million to 292 by the end of the century, and over 300 parts per million by the 1930s. In 1937, when Callendar published his paper, he linked it to man-made activities using infrared absorption rates and recognizing that this was being the cause for this. No one cared. In fact, the climate scientists who listened to his presentation on it were impressed with the amount of research and the time, but really didn't think it was really worth any data. What's funny now is that now we have supercomputers and being able to look back at ice cores and being able to take a look at the data that Callendar was able to project versus what we are able to project is that between 1887 and 1937, we added about 140,000 million tons of carbon dioxide, where Callendar's guess was 150,000 million tons of carbon dioxide. And so it's very impressive on how close he was without the modern technology that we have today. But I also found Callendar's reasons for people not believing it is also quite interesting. He had 4 different reasons. 1, the fact that something as simple as carbon dioxide could have such a great effect on everything. Our whole climate system just seemed crazy to understand. 2, it's hard to imagine that humans can have that much effect on the global world at a whole scale. 3, Callendar said that the meteorologists of the time had not put in enough study on the subject and thus were staying pat and thus weren't really recognizing what he was doing. And 4, people just don't think for themselves. They think in herds. They aren't willing to accept new data. This started to change then as we got into the late 50s and moving into the 80s in particular. We had Charles Keeling started to create more accurate data points by creating more accurate equipment to thus being able to put new weather stations together on top of volcanoes and recognize the Keeling curve that we were increasing our CO2 production. And methane now started also getting looked at and recognizing its effect in this. We started recognizing that we initially thought from the 40s to the 60s that we were going through global cooling and actually the aspect of going into a global ice age, but it was due to the aspect that we were burning so much coal and oil that the amount of sulfur that we were putting into the atmosphere was actually reflecting back some of the sun's rays and thus for a short temporary period of time was actually causing cooling on the planet. This culminates in 1988 when James E. Henson's speech to the Senate talking about this discoveries on climate was presented during the hottest week on record in 1988, which has been passed multiple times over. And in that led to the UN and the World Meteorologist Organizations coming up with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we have talked about multiple times on the podcast, and thus them coming out on reports talking about this and talking about how a lot of environmental injustice was happening because the poorest countries who had the least amount of effect of what was going on within the climate were getting affected the most by sea level change and things of that nature because of these effects. And thus, it led to, in 2006, Al Gore coming out with An Inconvenient Truth, and thus the public were fully ingrained into this. And I'll attach links down below coming from NASA showing how, again, we've had continued carbon dioxide rise, we've had sea level rise, we have had ice sheets decreasing, and it list goes on and on and on. Why do I bring this up with Mary and Martha? Why do I bring this up when we're talking about making sure that we're not cheating the system and that God's going to remember this? I think we have had multiple people trying to sound alarms for a long time. And I think as a global community, we have figured out ways to be Martha. Remember, 1937 was right before World War II. As a lot of Keening's data was happening, we were in the Cold War here in the United States. There has always been things to be distracted by. There's been things to say that were suddenly more important. And maybe in the moment it was. But the aspect too of when do we ever sit and listen at the feet of Jesus and process and actually think about things as individuals and as a group, to be able to bounce things off, to ask questions, to ask follow-up questions, not just over here as I'm continuing to dart here and there. If we are truly to be this body that we are kind of getting talked about in Colossians, and that we're able to grow and become this body embodying what Christ is, how are we able to do that if we're hustling and bustling so much that we can't hear difficult news and process it and think about it? And I think in the modern church that we are in, we have fallen into this trap just like plenty of Israelites and followers of the way for centuries. Our busyness at times forces us and challenges us to ignore difficult messaging, things that challenge us, things that push us to the edge, to now we're to the point where we have to listen. The amount of 500-year storms that we are seeing and watching, even as I watch my community get trampled by the windstorms that were 3 weeks ago. We have since then had the flooding down in Texas, and how vast and powerful and quickly the flash flooding was. We can't even cover on a national scale all the different storms that are happening, how quickly they are, and especially when we start expanding that to worldwide. At what point can we actually be a good neighbor, going back to last week, if we aren't able to actually recognize some of these things going on in our own neighborhood? And why aren't we able to acknowledge this? Why are we denying and pushing some of this away? Because it's an inconvenient thing. It means that my hustle and bustle, my things that I do on a day-to-day basis might have to change. And that might be hard and inconvenient. That might be a little weird, but isn't that what faith somewhat is? Like I stated at the beginning, if we aren't being challenged, what are we doing? The environment is something that we are told to take care of. We are told to take care of it from the beginning. And in the beginning of the Colossians text, we are talked about with that. We are talked about as, yes, we are part of creation. Creation has been crying out. Creation then has held us responsible. And as we have had people being able to sound the alarms, and as the majority, if not all, climate scientists are basically in unison saying, we are the effect on the climate now. As we are getting CO2 production to get to levels that we have never seen in any of the ice cores, as we are over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We are quickly approaching levels that make it the way that we think life should be, the climate that we have adapted to, more and more impossible. We are getting to the point of permanent change. Is that what we want? Is that what we're going for? Yes, there are times when we hear things and it's just hard to comprehend that we laugh like Abraham and Sarah. But also us ignoring it is not that much different than what is talked about in Amos. The people who swindle their way to get more cash, figuring out ways to tip the scales so they can get a little bit more. That comes back at some point. We are told that we have a God who does not forget those types of things. If we are truly being a body of Christ and being able to listen and acknowledge, we have to be like Mary. We need to sit and hear these hard truths. We need to be willing and able to do that. If we aren't, I would question what we're actually doing within this faith. If we aren't willing and able to acknowledge that our creation that we are told to take care of is suffering, and that there's more and more data, and the people who study it for a living are saying more and more unanimously, yes, we are the problem. Yes, our lifestyle is inflated. Yes, we are doing and there's ways we could get around this, but it means that you need to change. And people who aren't in that community suddenly saying, oh no, they can't be right. Their whole profession is wrong. They don't know what's going on. and we talk about our faith and how we know the way, but yet we're willing to deny? Is that the way that we are really supposed to evangelize? Is that really the way that we should be listening to difficult conversations? Is that love? Or is that moment where we actually need to sit and listen and work with it and use it as an opportunity to grow our faith, grow our understanding, grow our connection to the world? I think a lot of times we don't spend that time to actually stop, to actually recognize what's important. We get so caught up in going faster and faster and faster, and why isn't my Amazon package here, and why isn't this, and why isn't that? And in doing that, we don't recognize the hurt that we're causing. In the places that I've been this summer now, I'm also more and more dealing with smoke days, where we're at levels that it's not even just moderate, it's hazardous to be outside. I think we really need to think about what we're doing here. And we need to really think about that we are told that we are supposed to take care of this place, not think that we can take advantage of this place. Just because we are told that we are going somewhere at the end of life doesn't mean that we just abuse the place that we're in, because it's the body of Christ that goes on beyond us. So the question I have for you this week is, how are you going to make tangible steps to reduce your carbon footprint? How are you going to take tangible steps to reduce your carbon footprint? There's a lot of ways you can handle it. You can do things personally. You could do things politically. You can do things socially. You could make sure that you're taking care of people. You could make sure that you're doing things to help continue to reduce, strive for net zero carbon emissions. I know I'm not perfect by no means. There's a lot of room that I have to work and grow, and I realize, as much of an environmentalist as I am, there's still plenty of things where I take advantage of the environment. And I recognize in doing that I get to now see aspects of that. And some of these are my decisions that I have made over my lifetime, but some of them aren't. And I know that my decisions are not just affecting me. They're affecting future generations and all those behind me. They're affecting my elders now as they're not able to breathe as well as they once were able to. They're affecting my communities. And my community is not just to the geological location that I am. My community is this global community that we are all part of. Because when one of us suffers, we all suffer. And unless we can understand that and start seeing each other as neighbors, as we talked about last week, and being able to recognize that we're all in this together, that we're all striving for a better world, that at that moment, we'll truly be able to understand and see what God's love is. And maybe at that moment, we'll understand more of who Mary was like, sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening, instead of us constantly being busybodies and making excuses on why we can't do that. We've done that enough. At what point do we actually stop? Our busyness might actually kill us now. And it's not just going to kill one of us or a few of us, and it's not even just going to kill humans anymore. It's going to kill the place that we were told to take care of. And for me, it's frustrating that we've gotten to that point. And it's frustrating that I've contributed to that. And it's frustrating that we have to have these fights about things that for 150 years have been stated, and for over 100 years has been recognized as things are happening. And when are you going to recognize it? Guy Callender was right. Guy Callender predicted things and recognized things, and he was ahead of his time, and yet people still didn't listen. And then we still had where the results came through, and we still didn't listen. At what point do we listen, even as the data continues to build and build and build and build upon itself? Yes, we can be innovative, but we need to be innovative now to help with these problems. We complain about how much we have to put into environmental crisis damage control. Well, this is part of the reason why. Because we made this bed, now we have to sleep in it. And at what point are we actually going to recognize that and maybe try doing something and recognize it's going to get worse before it gets better? And it's maybe not for something in my lifetime even that I get to see the effects. Maybe it's something for my grandchildren or great-grandchildren, but is that not worth it? Is that not part of passing on the faith as we have been talked about for generations, and it's in this Colossians text this week? Recognizing we all rejoice together or we all suffer together. And I think it's time that we really, truly embody that and recognize that we all go through that. And then thus, this should empower us to do something about it. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.